Okay, I'm going to go over the answers to these genetics problems. It says the alleles for dimples, big D, is dominant to the allele for no dimples, small d. A man heterozygous for dimples marries a woman who's also heterozygous for dimples. What's the man's genotype and the woman's genotype? Well, first of all, there are a few definitions here that we need to take a look at and make sure we understand. The first one is heterozygous. So if you look back at your notes here, right here, it says heterozygous means the alleles are different. That means you basically have one of each from each of your parents. So one is dominant and the other one is recessive. That's what heterozygous means. The other form of alleles you could get, the combination of alleles, is homozygous. That means either it's big E, so both dominant, or small e, both recessive. And that's not the case in this problem. In this problem, we have a heterozygous individual, so that means one is dominant and one inherited allele is recessive. So one of each. So let's go back down. And it says, what is the man's genotype and the woman's genotype? Well, if they're both heterozygous, then both their genotypes should be exactly the same because there's only one way you can write the alleles for heterozygous. So that means the man's genotype must be big D, small d. The woman's genotype, she's also heterozygous, must be also big D, small d. So that means that both individuals have a dominant allele for dimples and also a recessive allele for no dimples because they're both heterozygous. Which just means that if they do have children, in the end, it's possible that the children do get passed on the recessive trait, which is no dimples. Okay, so let's go on. What is the man's phenotype and the woman's phenotype? So the difference between a genotype and a phenotype is a genotype really just describes the alleles. So we use the letters D in this case to describe the alleles, big D, small d. That's a type of genotype. Phenotype is just describing what kind of trait do they show. So to figure out what trait they show, if you look up at the problem here, it says big D is dimples, small d is no dimples. So if both of these individuals have a big D, that trait dominates over the other one, which means that in the end, both of them should show that they have dimples. So that means the man's phenotype must be dimples. So the man has dimples, and the woman's phenotype also dimples. Okay, and that's called a phenotype. Phenotype is describing what it is that they're showing. So if we describe them as having big D, small d, that's a genotype. We've just described a genotype. If we describe one of them as being dimpled, that's a phenotype. So phenotype is how you would describe them qualitatively, and the genotype is how you would describe them quantitatively. Basically, what are the alleles that are in them? Okay, so let's go down to the next question. It says, do a cross using a Punnett square. So I'm going to draw a Punnett square here. Let's use a different color. Okay, so I'm going to draw a Punnett square. And then I'm going to write both of their genotypes. So I'm going to write the male's genotype at the top, big D, small d. The female's genotype across the left, big D, small d. And figure out what the probability is of them having different types of genotypes for their offspring. So you basically simply match the column to the row. So this would be big D, big D. This would be big D, small d. You always write the dominant letter first. That's just a convention, so we don't get confused. So it's always the case. So big D, and small d, small d. So this is a cross. We're crossing this individual crossed with this individual. And these are the results that we get. So it says to determine all the potential dimpled genotypes and phenotypes for the offspring. Well, in this case, we can write that we have a quarter or 25% big D, big D. We have a half big D, small d. And we have another quarter, the remaining quarter of the two recessive alleles. And then we can also describe the phenotypes. So overall, these two genotypes would be the same phenotype. They will both be dimpled. So if we look at the phenotypes, and let me just highlight this in yellow here, all of these will be dimpled. So that's 3/4. So we can say that for the phenotype, 3/4 are dimpled, and the remaining 1/4 is non or not dimpled. All right, so these are called the genotypic and phenotypic ratios. So for the genotypic ratio, we have got a quarter, big D, half, big D, small d, heterozygous, and then a quarter, small d, that's a homozygous recessive. And for the phenotypic ratios, we have 3/4 dimpled and 1/4 not dimpled. Remember, phenotype is just a description. Genotype is actually showing the alleles that are in that individual. All right, the next one says the allele for hitchhiker's thumb, small h, is recessive to straight thumb, big H. So let's just highlight that. Hitchhiker's thumb, small h, recessive to straight thumb, big H. If a man and his wife are both homozygous recessive, will any of their offspring potentially have hitchhiker's thumb? So let's go through this step by step. A says, what is the man's genotype and the woman's genotype? So the man's genotype, they're both homozygous recessive. So if they're both homozygous recessive, that means both of them have the same allele, small h, small h. That's homozygous, meaning they're the same, the two are the same, and they're both recessive. So the same with a woman, small h, small h. What is a man's phenotype and the woman's phenotype? Well, they're recessive, so they both have hitchhiker's thumb. So we can say hitchhiker thumb, and that's for both of them. What genotypes must the offspring have in order to have the phenotypic trait of hitchhiker's thumb? Well, the genotype of the offspring must be homozygous recessive in order to have hitchhiker's thumb. So to get the phenotype of hitchhiker's thumb, their genotype must be small h, or homozygous recessive for hitchhiker's thumb. There's no other way, because if they had the straight thumb allele anywhere, they would be straight thumb, because that's a dominant allele. It says do a cross to determine all potential hitchhiker thumb genotypes and phenotypes for the offspring of this man and woman. Okay, is it possible for any offspring of the F1 generation, that's the first generation, to have hitchhiker's thumb? Well, let's see. Okay, so since they're, let's just draw a Punnett square first. Since they're both homozygous recessive, we're going to draw the cross like that. We're going to cross the male and the female and make a Punnett square. Just looking at the two genotypes, it should be plainly obvious that there's no way, there's not even a dominant allele from either of them. So there's no way any of the offspring should have the dominant allele, big H, at all. So we'll still draw the Punnett square, and we'll cross these two individuals, and you can see that all of the offspring, 100% of the offspring, will have will be dominant recessive. That means all of them, 100%, will have hitchhiker's thumb. So it says the question is it possible for any offspring of the F1 generation to have hitchhiker's thumb? So the answer is yes. 100% of F1. F stands for filial, which basically means the son or daughter, will have hitchhiker thumb. Okay, so that answers that question. Let's go on to the next one. And it says, in a certain breed of dogs, the gene big L codes for hair length. The dominant trait is short hair. Okay, let's be careful here. So L codes for hair length, the dominant trait, so that means big L is short hair. And already that could confuse some people because you normally think of, short must mean small letter, but that's not not what it's saying here. So you have to be really careful with this. So right away I would write on the side, just make a note to myself, dominant trait, so big L is short hair, just to avoid confusion later, and recessive is long hair. So recessive, which I like to do a scripted or cursive L because lowercase l is hard to see otherwise. It looks like a 1, so I don't like that, so I like to do a curly L. And that's long hair. Suppose a heterozygous female dog and a homozygous recessive male dog mate. What is the male dog's genotype and the female dog's genotype? So the male dog, it says it's a homozygous recessive male dog. So the male dog is homozygous, that means both alleles are the same, and recessive. So both little l's. Female dog says heterozygous female dog, so that must mean big L, small l, because that's heterozygous. B, what is the male dog's phenotype? Okay, so the male dog's phenotype with small l, would be long hair. And if you look at our guide on the right here, and this is why I wrote it down to make sure I kept track of that, because otherwise it can be confusing, just trying to memorize what went on earlier in the problem. The female dog's phenotype has to be short hair. But you can see by her genotype, that she is a carrier for the recessive long hair allele as well. So there is a possibility that some of the offspring might have long hair because she is a carrier for that, and the male is also a carrier for a long hair allele. Next question. What will be the genotypic ratio of the F1 generation? So again, that's the first generation after they mate. So let's take a look at the Punnett square resulting from this. So the cross that we're going to do is small l crossed with big L small l. And so let's do a Punnett square for that. Okay. So let's see, percentage-wise, we have 50% or 1/2 is big L small l. So that's this is the genotypic ratio. 50% or 1/2 is small l small l. We also want to write out the phenotypic ratio. So this is the genotypic ratio. We also want the phenotypic ratio. Phenotypic ratio. Okay, so it's also going to be 1/2. So 1/2 will be short hair, and 1/2 will be long hair. Okay. I think I just answered the second question. So we're just going to go like this. What will the phenotypic ratio be of the F1 generation? Well, it'll be just that, 1/2, short hair, long hair. All right, and that's basically how you solve these types of problems. So make sure you know your vocabulary. What is a genotype? What is a phenotype? Also, make sure you know what homozygous means, heterozygous, and also dominant and recessive. Make sure you know what those mean. Okay, till next time.